there's some research that supports the why do we debrief. So let's actually, this whole webinar is called The Art and a Little Science Behind the Training Experience Debrief. Let's take a look at that science. And when it comes to the science behind the importance of the training debrief, there is a lot of what you were writing here. You may or may not have taken a look at these studies. It maybe it was just kind of something that through your practice you have found the value in debriefs. But let me give you a little bit of information from several studies that I took a look at in preparation for today's webinar. And the first one goes all the way back to 1978. For those of you who are around, and I was certainly around, I was about 2 or 3 at the time, there was a study focused on the generation effect. And this, when they talk about the generation effect, they're not talking about baby boomers or Generation X, which is the best generation, by the way, or millennials or other folks. They're talking about generating actual content for yourself. Now, in this study, what they found was that learners can better remember words and ideas that they themselves come up with. This is something that actually I was kind of first exposed to this concept through the Bob Pike Group, and they do some great training and train the trainer programs as well. But when we take a look at this study, what it basically, or basically how they did this study was they asked people, some people in the study, to come up with an antonym for a word like cold, hot, right? So people came up with their own words. And then there's a control group that was just given a list of words to remember. And then basically when they kind of took a look at the results of the study, asking people to remember what words that they experienced during that experience, people who actually came up with the words themselves were able to remember those words better than people who just read something on a paper. Now, for me, what this tells me is that when it comes to post-training activity experiences, it is a lot better for us to be able to ask some intentional questions to help people process what they learned and articulate what they learned using their own words than it is for us to say, we're running short on time. We just finished that activity. I want to make sure that you know exactly the intent of that activity. What we did that activity for was X, Y, and Z purposes. When we can get learners to share their own thoughts or words, they're able to remember that better. Let me bring you fast forward. Let's fast forward a few decades to 2005, and we'll take a look at another study. And this study was actually done around medical simulations. And so, what they found in this study was that educational feedback, also known as debriefing, was the most important factor in medical education. Now, this particular study wasn't just taking a look at one group, an experiment group and a control group. This study was a meta-analysis of a number of different studies. And what the researchers found was that debriefing a simulation or an experience in medical education was the single most important component to a learning experience. It was more important than having people do the same task over and over until they got it right. It was more important than including a range of task difficulty, so going from easy to hard. Debriefing was more important than incorporating a bunch of different learning strategies into the instruction. And debriefing was even more important than individualized learning. So that is a pretty strong case for why it's really important not for the debrief to be an afterthought. Oh, we just did an activity. Let me quick think of a question that I can ask the group. Debriefing is something that's really important to be intentional about. And then let's take a look at the third study. And this was another meta-analysis around the role of reflection in individual learning. And there are kind of three conclusions that came out of this particular study. The people who did this research basically came to the conclusion that learning by thinking is actually more important than learning by doing. I want to repeat that. Learning by thinking is much more important than learning by doing. I also want to give an asterisk to this because if you have the choice between learning by doing and learning by listening, let's do learning by doing. But that's only half the battle. We also need to think about how do we get people to reflect on and think about the experience they just had. And so when it came to this particular study, they found that participants who reflected on their experience, they showed a statistically significant higher improvement in their accuracy to do a task compared to a group that just practiced without actual reflection. Another conclusion was that merely doing a task repeatedly, meaning giving people more experience with that task in a practice setting, didn't automatically lead to learning or improved performance. That's kind of the definition of insanity, right? Have somebody do the same thing over and over and over again without any sort of reflection or learning. And then finally, reflection boosted a person's confidence and their ability to do a task. So those are pretty important pieces. That confidence piece is really important, especially if we want people to take this task or take what we taught somebody and use it when they go into the actual real world setting. So we just talked about some, a lot of the chat involved. You all actually have lots of good reasons why we debrief. And I just wanted to share just a few studies, and there's a lot of studies out there around the importance of debriefing.